Make things easy for me, I'm introducing Robin, Joe, and Mark, and they'll explain what they're here to tell us about. Thank you.
Thank you, Berta. Can everybody hear me okay? Is this an okay volume? Good. So our purpose and I think our mission will reveal itself as we speak to you today and share some experiences. I'm here with my two colleagues and friends, Joe and Mark. We've been working together for a number of years now, and I believe that our work is to disturb structures and also in a way to work in disturbing structures. There's been much talk here about the medical model, and we work in systems infused tremendously with the medical model for several reasons. Litigiousness and risk management are very popular terms inside of correctional systems. And for this reason, the medical model is alluring in many ways and used frequently. So each day, the three of us, we choose to walk in to these facilities and gates of chain links and steel motors whirring, slamming behind us as we patiently wait for the next to open. Eventually, often 30 minutes since leaving the ironic safety of our vehicles in the parking lot, we arrive at our place, take our seats, and try desperately to block the noise out and just be present. And why? We ask ourselves and each other that question frequently. And as my friend Mark said to me one fateful day several years ago, that, unfortunately, is where our people are. To say that American jails and prisons are the new state hospitals is a tragic truism. Rates of childhood adversity, early trauma, astronomical numbers. In fact, recent studies tell us that we should be operating under a universal assumption of trauma in this population. But not just the inmates who are in distress, no. The COs, correctional officers, show increased rates of depression and anxiety, elevated suicide rates, almost 40% higher than the free world and general population, increased rates of divorce, decreased feelings of connectedness, decreased sense of empathy, ability for empathy, increased feelings of isolation and detachment, and early death in some studies by 15 or 16 years relative to the general population. Each time I prepare a talk on this topic of trying to be trauma-informed in a correctional system, which is a paradox in many ways, I find myself reflecting on what this means for me in this system. How am I impacted as a person, as a father, as a psychologist, as a husband? All of these roles are certainly impacted by this, and what do I do with this awareness when it comes to me? With trauma overwhelming a system like this, just to be with another in co-constructed moments of safety and security and silence can be powerful and beautiful and healing. We are known in the US for our rates of incarceration, but who is actually in jail? We know that they're disproportionately young, male, poor, and hold minority status. The number of individuals diagnosed with so-called serious mental illness in jails now exceeds the number with so-called serious mental illness in state hospitals tenfold, with approximately 35,000 in state hospitals and 350,000 in American jails and prisons. Rates of these experiences in jails are 2 to 4 times higher than in the free world. And some of this may be familiar or not very surprising to you, but what may be less so is where these people go once they're incarcerated. People with so-called serious mental illnesses are far overrepresented in restrictive housing units, where they're often confined to a cell 23 hours a day, with just 1 hour of time outside of their cell. And that is where, early on, a few of us felt we needed to go, reaching the patient wherever he or she was. And thus it is not surprising even if hard to imagine or hear, that we share with you some attempts to recover some sense of wholeness in that setting. I must agree with Krista McKinnon that change is slow, but it is happening. For years, many of us felt we were pushing on brick walls, just waiting for one to pop loose, with very little systemic support at times, terrifyingly so sometimes. We waited and waited and watched and lamented gaping holes in compassion and basic rights. And we tried with some success to introduce psychotherapy in segregation in those housing units, with suspicious gazes of staff as we walked into those dungeons. And as is often the case, litigation came to our system. And sometimes in corrections, that is the only way to have meaningful change. We saw substantial change, and a settlement between our system and the American Civil Liberties Union allowed for increased staffing, increased access, and dramatically decreased the number of those with diagnosed serious mental illnesses in those restrictive housing units. And so I'll turn it over to Mark, who will tell you what it looks like today.
I'm going to pull this out. Thanks for being here. I want to acknowledge Robin and honor Robin. Robin's been working in this system since like 2012 or even before, and was there before myself or Joe, and worked hard to bring people like myself and Joe and many others in, and that took a lot of work at a lot of different levels and a lot of presentations and a lot of arguments and I hesitate to say manipulation of people that hold the purse strings, but a lot of persuasion anyway. So I'm thankful for Robin. I'm also thankful for Lee Whitaker, and so part of telling the story of what we tried to do together with people after a bit of an opening was created comes from Lee Whitaker, who passed away recently. He's someone that Bert Karen long ago put me in touch with as I was a grad student and interested in the time that as I thought about it then, of being a very good therapist with schizophrenic people, and is there a cure out there? And if there is, I want to learn how to do that in like a therapy setting. And Lee and many others helped me come upon a different way of maybe looking at things. I met with Lee for many years and got to know him and his work. I want to talk about Lee and his empathic ward. So this is something that he and Arthur Dykman did in the 70s. I believe it was in the Colorado State Hospital system, where they got together, I guess through their various career paths. They ended up at this state hospital system at the same time. And they had this idea to create a different kind of place, a different kind of ward or unit, one where the goal would be that whatever patients or people came through, that they would leave stronger than they ever were before, stronger people, that they would leave being more active people, more constructive, and in Lee's words, more interpersonally accomplished. It's something I know that he was working on for himself as well. But in order to do this, they had a few ideas. These are ideas I don't think are new. They can be found in different kinds of literature. But a few assumptions they had, and that Lee had communicated to me over the years, were that positive interpersonal influences can be very powerful. And those interpersonal influences don't have to come from a therapist in the context of a therapist patient psychotherapy, but they could just be between people that maybe inhabit the same space at the same time. And that, a little more on that positive interpersonal experiences, maybe they're positive to the extent that there's some trust building that's allowed to happen. And if there can be true power sharing, and I'm thinking of what Mike Nelson said yesterday, not me as clinician giving the person the power or the opportunity to speak, but some other kind of notion or belief where the power is really out there in all of us, and can we make room for each other? Lee it taught me to take such ideas seriously before I had a chance to try to experiment with them. But anyway, they opened such a place in the 70s. They decided that medication would not be used at all unless they felt their efforts were failing and there was a question of safety. What did that look like? Of course, there were some group stuff happening in this ward that Lee and Arthur had. There was individual therapies and whatnot. But there was a lot more than that happening. And so I want to just talk about a Halloween party that they had to illustrate, or at least for me, it illustrates trust and power sharing. So in this Halloween party on this ward in the 70s in Colorado, the patients decided to hold a Salem witch trial sort of event, and they put the staff on trial and convicted them of various therapeutic crimes. And each staff member was sentenced to put their hand or foot in cold water for different amounts of time. Of course, it was proportional to the amount of crimes and the severity of the crimes. And that is what happened. Also, as part of this party, the patients wanted the keys to the isolation room, and they got them, and all the staff were put in the isolation room. And the staff went, and they were not permitted to leave until after a period of good behavior, which was about 20 or 30 minutes. Lee Wright said after this kind of weekend blast, that the family feeling on the ward became really palpable. The sense of connectedness was really hard to ignore. And humor was, as you might imagine, very prevalent in all of the interactions between people. The patients around that time had also asked that the ward be unlocked, that the door, the main door be unlocked. And staff had concerns. They decided to all talk about that, patient, staff, everyone in between, and talk about the responsibilities there, and to see if they could share the responsibility for that. And they decided to give it a go. And they did, and had no elopements for the remainder of the time that the ward was in operation, which was about a year. The culture of the ward, as Lee wrote about and Arthur, was one that disapproved of violence, as you might imagine. That wasn't something that was imposed by the staff, but something that sort of, I guess was co-constructed. It came from every which way. As people, if a person did start to hurt themselves or start to threaten someone else, everyone got up to try to do something about it. The community came to that person with curiosity, some expectation that they could figure out some alternative to hurting themselves. So I wondered if we could do something like this in our little system, in our little corner of the world, when an opportunity came to work with people that would otherwise be in solitary confinement or otherwise, in maximum security parts of the prison. How crazy would it have to be, or would I have to be, or mistaken to try to do something like this in a prison setting? And so I'm going to pass the mic to Joe to talk about one of his experiences with someone that that lives with us, and I'll come back a little later to say a little more. But
all right, thanks, Mark. This is a new experience for me, actually holding a mic. Haven't done this outside of karaoke, so this is pretty cool. It has been done in the past. But before I get into talking about my case in our little corner of the world, as Mark describes it, I want to go back to 2 years and 1 month ago. It was a mid-October, really chilly, rainy Thursday afternoon, and I was applying for a pre-doctoral internship in this particular state prison, not really knowing what to expect, not necessarily knowing what I was getting myself into potentially. And I was greeted by Robin and Mark at the gate, and I was particularly struck with each passing security point, and Robin alluded to this, but at each passing gate, the very slow closing behind you. I may add, just feeling more and more isolated as you continue to kind of descend into this kind of darker, lonely world that's not really spoken about. And I was particularly struck by that, and kind of knowing the vision that Robin and Mark had. I remember thinking to myself, how in this setting, in this environment, how in this can we create a sense of community? And at that time, I was thinking to myself, the sense of community that's built, it's one idea, it's one conversation, it's one exchange at a time between clients and staff, between staff and staff, between clients and clients. And so, and I'll get to introducing my case that I'll be talking about this afternoon. I've been working with Ray now for actually exactly 2 years, and he's a 52-year-old African-American male who has been incarcerated since the age of 18. He is serving a life sentence. And he's incarcerated for what would be considered a rather heinous crime. And this is someone who, while he was locked up, he on multiple occasions went back and forth to the state hospital when it was deemed that he might be too dangerous or unsafe around other individuals. And he would go to the state hospital, and he would stabilize, as they might say, and he would come back. And he is one of these individuals Robin was talking about, kind of maximum security and confinement within confinement. And so for decades, this is Ray is an individual who is in isolation, in an already isolating environment. And coming out of his cell, 1 hour, per day, just to kind of give the background of kind of where he's coming from. But really, in my early work with Ray and so many, really all of our guys, really what they're striving for is connection, and for so long, they've been isolated, in these cells. It's deemed as dangerous. Correctional officers aren't interacting with them. Even a lot of maybe their fellow inmates who maybe don't have extreme state experiences or altered experience. Maybe they're not engaging with them, or if they are engaging with them, they might be taking advantage of them in some way, and it's not a pro-social or positive interactions. And so one of the things that that became really evident early in my work with Wei was he's very concerned about his fellow man, and really is someone who likes to advocate for other people and wants the best for other people. And truly, this is actually and it's these qualities that are actually why he's in prison in the first place. He was a gentleman who, he was doing yard work for a neighborhood family when he was in high school. He was 18 years old at the time, and he was working doing yard work for an elderly couple, and the husband had a lot of medical issues, a lot of medical concerns, and he believed that he was putting this gentleman out of his misery. It was a call from a higher order to put this man out of his misery. In this case, and that's really kind of what led him, what led to his incarceration. But so again, this kind of flows along with his, wanting to advocate for people, people that he believes might be taken advantage of or are ostracized or in pain. And so one of the roles that he has actually for us on the tier, which is in our program, which is really very neat, is so he has a lot of energy and is very invested in other people, continuing their recovery path as well, and what he does, once a week. Either myself or one of our other therapists will give him a list of folks who will be seen for individual therapy on that day. We give him that list, and he one by one goes to their door. Tells them that they're being expected, encourages them, in a very positive way. In a very encouraging way, in a very gentle way, and it's very interesting to see even like correctional officers note and comment on, seeing this and saying it's like we've never kind of we don't usually get to see this side, of these people. And it's really an opportunity to see him come alive, and he's getting in touch with his values and what's important to him. And he's in the midst of that experience when he's doing this. And so during my 2 years now in our little corner of the world, so I have gone from a trainee, a pre-doctoral intern, to now a psychological assistant and postdoctoral fellow. And so in my work together with, my professional identity and development has really evolved, and I would say our work has evolved in the same way, and has evolved in step with that. And I want to talk about a couple stories where interactions that I've had with Ray that have really shaped and helped to mold and influence how I am, or how I try to be with my clients. So about 5 or 6 months into our work together, Ray says to me, in our session, kind of, I felt it felt to me like it was kind of out of the blue. He said, Joe, I don't feel that I'm like guilty, for the crime that I committed. And not knowing the context of his crime at that time, I was very, my reaction at that time was I was bothered by it. I was a little arrested, a little taken back, and I shut off. And it shut down my curious side, the side of me that's accepting. And to be honest, I don't even have a recollection of how I steered it away from that conversation at that time. Probably kind of stammered along in some way, and wasn't very helpful in some way. But then a couple months later, it comes up again, and I kind of do the same thing. It comes up again in quicker succession each time, and yeah, he's trying to tell me something, right? And eventually, I stood, just a probing, question. I was like, tell me a little bit about that. And then he tells me the story that I had previously told you about, kind of, what he was thinking, in that moment, that he thought he was really, and that he thought he was really, in basically every way, like saving this guy. And that was an extremely, and that led to a shift in the discourse, between us, and you could see Ray kind of brighten, and obviously for me too. There's been this moment in therapy for several months where there's this massive kind of object in the room, and I wasn't doing really anything to push it forward. And so that really kind of, for me, and instilled the sense that I have to, to remain open and accepting and curious. It's more so about the stance than like any technique or any tangible technique that we might implement. And the second story that I want to talk about. So this about a year into our work, Ray was involved in an incident where he actually became assaultive towards a correctional officer, and in situations where individuals are either deemed a suicide risk or a risk of harm to others. They go to something called psychiatric close observation, where you are not out of your cell in any period of time until you're deemed appropriate and stable to come back off. And so this occurred over a weekend, a Friday night. And so I read the email and see that he's in on PCO for this incident. And the whole weekend, I'm just thinking, oh gosh, like this is not good. Like first thing Monday morning, I'm going down there, and I'm expecting to see him, kind of completely falling apart, and I'm really, really anxious, nervous what I'm going to see. And I go down there first thing on Monday morning, and he, sees me in the window, biggest smile on his face. He comes up to the door and is like, hey Joe, it's really, really good to see you. I didn't know if I was going to see you while I was down here. I appreciate you coming down. And I was kind of taken aback by that. And really, just what reinforced for me is, as I was talking earlier, Ray's really, his drive, his drive is, in connection. What gives him energy is connection, and how much that meant for him. But then on it for me is, the resilience that he demonstrated in that moment, and in that series of interactions, he was. And so the reason, and as we talked about it, turns out the reason that he went to PCO was keeping in line with some of his values. So one of the correctional officers was giving one of the other inmates a hard time. Ray did not like what was going on, and he swung at this gentleman, which keeps in line with him wanting to look out for others and to have their best interests in heart. But it was the resilience piece that despite another example of being further confined within a system of confinement, there he was and ready to engage and have a conversation. And for me, and working in a system that's traumatized, that's so traumatized, if I can, as a therapist, if I can model resilience the way that he did, that's something that will go a long way. And then in wrapping up my segment here, I just wanted to share, so this past week I talked with Ray about that I was going to be presenting at this conference and hoping to talk about him. And I asked him, how he views our relationship. And he says to me, Joe, I feel as though you were sent here by God. And spirituality has always been, so Ray was as his experience of childhood was one where his birth mother gave him up for adoption, and he experienced, as he says it to me, he experienced his birth mother as kind of oscillating between cold and aloof and like demanding and like hostile. And so spirituality was always a place where he could find peace and respite. And so not only, so obviously that quote, there's a lot of pressure for me to like live up to with that with that statement. But at the same time, what that says to me, knowing how important spirituality was for him, especially, growing up, is that he really feels safe, in our dyad and in that space. And if I can, and working with all my clients in an environment that is traumatized, if I can, if there's one thing that I can do, regardless of technique or anything, if I can create a space, that's always a good place to start. So I'll hand it off to Robin again. Thank you all.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, that's something that we all talk about with some sense of frustration at times, that how do you establish a sense of safety, which I believe is a prerequisite for any sort of trauma-informed treatment in a place that may objectively be unsafe. And so we sort of try to live in this moment, in this room, and try to capture the safety of that moment. Before I start talking about this case, I want to just share a phenomenon that I observed in the last session. We were following along in a call and response, and there was something that went, so stress is bad, it creates symptoms, and symptoms lead to, and the whole room went to this, and everybody said hospitalization, like almost in unison. And I looked at my colleagues, and to us, we're so exposed to the criminalization of these experiences that we were all thinking incarceration. And I wonder what kind of privilege allows us to say hospitalization perhaps versus incarceration, given what we know about who's in jail. I want to talk about another case that I don't want to give the impression that we treat heinous murderers only, and that all people with these types of experiences result in murder. We know that to be exactly the opposite of the case. And in fact, when we do meet these folks, they are, consistent with the research, far more likely to be the victims of crime than they are to perpetrate them. And there is almost always significant mitigating information, which is what we would call it in the law, that helps to maybe not excuse, but to explain some of the behavior. And I think that's that curiosity that Joe was speaking about as well. I made up the name Harrison. I think it captures him. He's a 23-year-old male, and the way that he came into my life, I drive around the state. I have a statewide position, and I get bulletins when there's front page criminal justice news, and I'm pretty good at figuring out when a crime is like, this guy sounds like he might need some attention when we get to him. And so this was one of those cases where there was a broad daylight, very heinous, very inexplicable alleged offense happen, and so we made sure to meet him when he was brought to the jail, so somebody was there actually waiting for him in order to intervene as best we could and as early as we could. So it was tragic, and I hadn't entered the case yet at all. He was seen by a very talented psychologist who does a lot of evaluations, and as well as a psychiatric nurse practitioner who's also very talented. And they described him as not knowing what had happened. They described a far-off gaze, sort of distant, aloof, maybe dissociative a little bit, and seeming to respond to communications that nobody else could see. I had a colleague 2 days later who noted that he knows why he was there, but he was quote-unquote looking around the room, avoiding eye contact with me, and listening intently to others. And then he stops talking and then just looks down and would not respond any further, shut down, end quote. I thought that was a really powerful observation, not one that you would normally see. It didn't seem very pathological, but much more descriptive and helpful. So the media is going wild, and they share with us that this individual begged the police to kill him. That's how much distress he was in when he was caught for the crime, when they arrested him. And so I'm trained in forensic psychology. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, but board certified in forensic psychology. And so part of my job is to do risk assessments and develop some management plans. I know that term is very pejorative at times, but these are creative ways to manage people's risk for interpersonal aggression. Various strategies exist. So I get referred to determine if this guy is going to hurt somebody, basically. And so I come to see him. And he tells me that he's, quote, overwhelmed by everything, end quote. I described him as quiet, very distant, obviously questioning me and my motives, admits to hearing voices at that time. Mumbling is what he describes, and then he describes at times hearing multiple voices talking to each other and also to him and about him, sort of that Schneiderian type of voice hearing. I see him whispering to himself, and then the most powerful quote from the notes as I was reviewing the case, this is from several years ago, he says, quote, "I always thought I could control it. I never thought I would be in this situation," end quote. In that moment, I feel curious. I want to learn. I want to help. I'm being pulled to help, and at the same time feeling very helpless. I don't know what to do, and I hearken back to some of our analytic training where we went to school, where we talked a lot about don't just do something, sit there, right? And so, but it's really hard when someone's telling you this stuff, right? It's pulling you. I was brokenhearted for him. He's young. He's 23. Looks like he's 16. So the next day, he tells my colleague that the voices are now screaming. He describes chaos in his head, and there's this note that says the meds are helping little from the psychiatrist. So I always thought that was fascinating. And so now I'm really curious. And there's also a note about how he is feeling targeted. There are lots of interdisciplinary conversations. Where do we house this guy? What do we do with him? And we want to try to get him to what we call a transitional unit, which is very similar to Mark's program. And he starts to describe feeling bullied very quickly when he gets there. And it's another example of sort of being more likely to be the victim, being vulnerable, than you are to be a perpetrator. He ends up in a fight. He gets in a physical altercation. It turns out that he's targeted because the victim of his crime was a gang member, and that gang member had affiliations inside, and they really were targeting him, and many people were writing this off as a delusion, right? As this persecutory ideation, rather than he's actually being targeted. So he gets in a fight. He goes to this restrictive housing unit. He comes back to the housing unit for people with diagnosed serious mental illnesses, and that's where I engage him in psychotherapy at this point as part of a plan to convince security that he's not so dangerous that he can't be with other people. I say I'm going to take him into psychotherapy as part of that plan. And so that's how I meet him. The goal, because we have to have goals and on our treatment plans or else the powers that be get very angry, is to develop a relationship. That was it. I was like, how hard could that be? But I did look back at my note, and I actually added in parentheses, which will serve as a formidable task. So I see him almost silent, very quiet. We spend 5 minutes together in silence, and any of you who are therapists or have been in therapy, even in the most beautiful and comfortable office, that can be incredibly challenging. And when you have a noisy jail, 5 minutes alone in silence it's magical and terrifying. It's intense. And we do it the following week, and we do it the following week, to the point where our oversight body says, what are you doing in there? Like, your 5-minute sessions, what are these, you know? But that's what he could tolerate. And one day, I'm probing. I'm starting out saying, you know, tell me a little about yourself. What's important to you? How are things? Trying to get something, elicit something. And one day I ask him what's important to him, and he tells me his mother. That's a great answer, right? Okay, we can work with that. I follow up. Nothing. I can't get anything more. There's just silence and silence and silence. And one day he walks in the room. It was our 10th session together, and he immediately starts out and he says, "I need help." You got me, man. What can I do for you? How can I help you? And he complains that the injectable he's been getting, the psychotropic injectable, is causing pain at the site of the injection on his shoulder. Meanwhile, it's continuing in the notes to say that the meds are having little impact, that he's continuing to experience, they're calling negative symptoms, positive symptoms, things like that. I see an opportunity. And so I immediately go and I talk to the psychiatric provider, and she and another psychiatrist in consultation come and meet with him the next day, and they change him to an oral medication. I didn't realize how powerful that was going to be, that responsiveness. But the following week, he says thank you to me, which I thought was big. And that same session, he tells me that he loves to read urban novels and that he's a big 76ers fan. And so I'm getting somewhere. So I start to track how long our sessions are together, and they're 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 8 minutes, 10 minutes, and after about a year, we're sitting together for 25 minutes, which was phenomenal. He's telling me more about himself, and I started to use that as a data point. And I noticed that my sense of connectedness to him was growing as well in that time. And obviously the content was part of that. I was actually getting some. But the process expanding was also that. And I found myself learning about the Sixers and coming to sessions and having some information to build rapport. So then I get a subpoena. That was fun. This was about 18 months after I had started treating him. And he's going to trial on a murder trial. And they bring me in as a fact witness, as somebody who had evaluated him very close to the time of the crime and who had then treated him for all of these sessions. Basically, I try my best to, first of all, I discuss it with him at length about what I should say and what I shouldn't say and how can I was very nervous. And so I show up at trial and I meet his mother, which was really fascinating. She was there, and she was delightful and felt and conveyed a sense of deep shame and a sense of responsibility. And how did I not see this coming? That could be a whole other talk, I think. But I take the stand, and my whole goal is to articulate who this person is. What is his experience? What has he given me? And I worked really hard, and I described him as funny, quiet, a voracious reader, a lover of basketball, a deep sense of love for his mother, and somebody who's deeply, deeply remorseful and tragically ashamed of committing this crime. And it was a jury trial, so I had a chance to talk to a jury about this. And in the end, he was actually found guilty of second-degree murder instead of the first-degree murder that he was charged with, and was found what's called guilty but mentally ill, which is a horrible term for many reasons, not just clinically but legally and ethically. But and what that meant is that he went to the state hospital rather than spending his sentence in these conditions of confinement, and he remains there, and it's been about 1.5 years. So I had a chance to terminate with him as well right before he went. And so I got to ask him about his experience, and he was very grateful for what I had said on the stand about him, and that he was going to be going to the hospital. So he said, and I quote, "I didn't know that I could trust you, and nothing felt real." That's how he described those first sessions. And he said, "You told my story, the story I told you." And I can't read my note there, but he talked about that moment of the shot when he was switched from the injectable to an oral medication, because he noticed that he knew then that the team cared about him and was supportive of him and was going to literally take away some pain for him. That case has just had a lasting impact on my life and my career, and it was just very powerful, so I wanted to share that here.
It's good to hear about both those guys again. A couple weeks ago, I met with the people on one of these units that where I was trying to channel Whitaker and challenging ourselves to see what we could do together. And I use a big we, and not just mental health professionals, but people that have to live in these places and people that worked. What could we do together? I asked people to talk about their experience of the unit. I told them that I was going to be talking to some people with fancy clothes in a fancy hotel. What could I possibly say about what's been happening here? And again, there's about 30 people on this particular unit. Unfortunately, many people were in solitary kinds of situations before the sledgehammer of litigation came through, which is an ongoing struggle. The opening doesn't stay open. The forces to close it back up, to go back to the old ways, are ever present. But people with diagnoses that are the sorts of things we're talking about, people with psychotic experiences, however you want to say it. But here's some of what they said. I just kind of wrote it down. We learn how to function with other people, learn how to ask what's going on in another person's mind. There's no abuse. That seemed important to someone. Somebody said it's like a family. It's a family-like setting. We're still in a maximum. We're still in a maximum security part of the prison. And people are still locked in about 20 hours of the day, every day. But this is what they said. Being here, I've learned to be more in control of myself. Another guy, it's a place to get help, educated, a place to work on remorse. Another guy said, "We don't fight here, we stick up for each other." And he felt like that was a different kind of experience. Another person, "I can't think of anywhere else I'd rather be other than not in prison." Of course, that guy has a great sense of humor. Someone else, there's a lot of stuff to do. And then a couple people said, "I feel safe here, and even I feel free, that I have freedom here." A couple quick examples of what happens there. When we had, there was a young man who stayed in bed for many weeks, at months even. His peers and mental health staff and the correction officers, that we focus on those relationships as well. It was their patient persistent efforts over time to encourage him, to reach out to him, that helped him come out of bed and shower once, and that kind of unfolding. It took a lot of time. And now when there's a group, which happens on the unit, the officers, they've perverted their kind of security role to leave a door open during a group. Security is all about controlling movement and keeping things locked down, but they've allowed themselves to bend the rules to allow space for people to connect. And that's what this young man does now. When we had someone that couldn't physically take care of themselves, it was his fellows and the correction officers that would help him out each morning. The morning was the worst time of day. That's not something we put in a treatment plan or something that we had to figure out how to do. It kind of spontaneously happened, and I feel so lucky that kind of thing can happen in this kind of place. There have been a few instances where people have gotten a punch, whether they had it coming or not, I can't say or shouldn't say. But it's been pretty few and far between, and I'm grateful for that and proud of that fact. So I think that's all the remarks that we had. I don't know if there's any reactions or comments. Thank you.